Hello all, and welcome to Shatter Our Souls with Novaria. Today, we're continuing where we left off last week with the Bryyo collectables. Now, I'll be honest, Prime 1 and 2 had a collectathon that was more open-ended, that allowed you to get bits and pieces as you found them and moved on. But Prime 3's artifact and endgame collectible hunt is much more streamlined. I've mentioned this a few times, and I don't feel the need to kind of set that aside. But what I want to get across is that it makes sense in Prime 3 that your entire item hunt goes from one planet to the next. Starting, of course, with Elysia, Norion, the first planet you ever visited, and then to Bryyo, probably the pirate homeworld, and finishing off with the GFS of Valhalla. This is what makes the most sense to me, partially because that's the order of locations as they are released throughout the duration of the game. Of course, starting with Elysia, because that's the planet that we usually get all of the information, the hidden collectibles list, if you will, or the item list. The second being Norion, the planet you started on. Now, because Norion is such a early game location, most of the upgrades have already been found because it was trying to make sure that the player had access to X amount of upgrades before you get too far into the game. The third location, of course, is Bryyo. And Bryyo is the first really big location that we have to tackle, because it is the one that's had the least time spent on it since its, shall we say, since the game started. With, of course, the obvious exception of Nori. Now, the reason I want to put this out is because Bryyo has what I would consider to be four major locales. There's the cliffside, there is the Thorn Jungle, Bryyo Fire, and Bryyo Ice. Now, Fire and Ice are tied together at the hip by a teleporter. And so, theoretically, you can get from one to the other, finish off both halves, and done, right? But the Thorn Jungle air dock and the cliffside areas are also tied together, but by a late game shortcut. One that has to be activated on both sides before the player is able to access either one of them in a natural situation. What this effectively means is that, lo and behold, Samus is kind of in a little bit of a troublesome situation at the moment. Now, the reason I want to get at this and explain this to the fullest is because, in my mind, Bryyo is the most important revisit throughout the entirety of Prime 3's artifact hunt. The reason why this one is so important comparatively is because of the timeline in which you came. When you visit Bryyo Fire for the first time, you don't have access to anything that is going to keep you from taking damage in the pools of fuel gel. So you have that going for you. You need the hazard shield from the Space Pirate hideout to get it. Cool. What else do we have? Well, we have the boost ball, which we get on Elysia. But the last time we needed the boost ball and an item from Bryyo was to get here, and it was specifically for the screw attack. Which means at that time, we also didn't have the magnet ball to get this item. So now we're two upgrades that are late game that we need, but don't have access to right off the hop here, or when you first visit Bryyo. So, okay, where to next then? Well, we have a couple other options, a couple other items that are involved. The third is that when you are first visiting the cliffside air dock, you likely do not have access to the ice missiles, which are required from beating Rundus. And there is nothing pushing you in the main storyline to go back to the cliffside air dock until now. Meaning that there are items that you could have theoretically gotten, missile tanks primarily, that are all tied to beating Rundus of all characters. So now we have that. How about the plasma beam? Well, that one is a little more open-ended, I won't lie. But there's upgrades guarded by the Nova beam. There are upgrades guarded by the screw attack. There are upgrades guarded by the boost ball and the magnet ball. All of these mean that Bryyo is the most lucrative location to go to during the endgame item hunt. But it doesn't just stop there. See, in other Metroids, early game areas usually had a couple hidden nooks and crannies that were very easy, very notable to get to, finish off, visit, and say, okay, that's it, we're good, right? Prime 3's early game areas do have a lot of that very close mentality, shall we say. The items that you get in the Bryyo Fire, Bryyo Ice, etc. locations are all intended to be early game options, early game items. But Norian's and Bryo's, the number of items that you can find on Norian after your initial visit are peanuts. There were 3 to 4 items. Compare that to the Chozo Ruins from Prime 2, or Prime 1, sorry. And you'll find that most of those upgrades in the Chozo Ruins, yeah, you can get a good handful of them each time you go by, but you're not getting as much out of each trip as you do in your final run. So there are a lot of variances, shall we say, between each game and how they handle this endgame hunt. I've been pretty vocal about that fact, pretty open-minded about it. But this Bryyo has always felt like the best area in the trilogy to come back to. It's pretty quick, pretty simple. Typically about an hour of time will be spent on all of the artifact hunt of Bryyo, theoretically, because there should only be 1, maybe 2 power cells left in the entire area. So that's a non-issue. What other potential issues do we have in Bryyo? You have the fact that Bryyo Fire is incredibly linear and could potentially pose a problem, but the enemies are so low level that it's more of a walk in the park. It is your end game, haha, new game plus mode, I can rip through this area like it was a hot knife through butter. And that's one of the potential solutions, or one of the potential outlooks to have in this area. But somehow, some way, it doesn't end there. See, as I've kind of alluded to, every game has their own approach to the end game. Prime 1's had a more, shall we say, climactic showdown between Samus and Ridley, followed by dealing with the Phazon Seed itself, showcasing that Samus wasn't just on Talon 4 to take care of Ridley, but on Talon 4 for a more open-minded reason, and opted to help whatever was left of Talon 4 and hope that it would be more than a barren wasteland within 25 years. That's the hope that we wanted to see at the end of Prime 1. Prime 1 is more about hope than anything else. Prime 2 saw the final showdown between the Emperor of the Ing and the Guardian of the Luminoth in Samus. Emperor Ing and Samus have a grueling battle in the palace of the Ing themselves, the Sky Temple. This location where Samus is at a disadvantage, and yet she goes in wanting to finish the fight that she started, knowing full well that this next battle may very well be her last. But it would ultimately save an entire species from destruction, and also save an entire planet from the effects of Phazon. Prime 3's final battle is all about finishing the battle that started on Talon 4. Everything that Prime 3's leads up to is this high energy, high octane duel between Samus and Dark Samus. The pair of them pulling out every single piece of tech, every single item, every single upgrade that they have gained, every single drop of Phazon between the pair of them, in order to showcase just what the pair of them were actually capable of. But it's more than that in many ways, shapes, and forms. This is, for Samus, revenge for the loss of 3 of her comrades in the form of Gandreda, Rundus, and Gore. This is payback for what Dark Samus did on Aether. This is, in some way, shape, or form, payback for what Dark Samus did on Norian. This is more than just Samus getting revenge, however. This is also her getting closure, that this saga, this problem, is finally over. And so, to me, Prime 3's finale is meant to be more climactic. And so less time is spent on this aspect of the game, this moment, this series of events, than any other Metroid. See, for a long time, I always saw the Prime 3's Artifact and Collectathon as the weakest of the 3. And I think for a pretty decent batch of reasons. But going back and analyzing each game on Hypermode, and how each game interacts with one another, I came to the realization that there is more beneath the surface behind the artifact hunt and the collectathon aspect at the end of the game than there was. There's more to it than what I initially anticipated, whether it was because I was too focused on getting to the end game or finishing it, or whether I had some ulterior mentality around it, I can't say. What I can say for certain is that we are now at the Cliffside Air Dock. This area needs to be completed before we do the Thorn Jungle Air Dock for a oddly specific reason. I will get there in a little bit. For now, enjoy the fact that we got a little bit of running around to do before we finish this off. Anywho, Prime 3's whole gambit, its whole gimmick, was around the fact that it was meant to be more high octane, more fast paced. This is integral to its game feel. Yes, it does hold your hand and push you along a lot more than the other two do. But Prime 1 and 2 had this mentality of, you finish the fight when you're ready. You battle against the final bosses when you are good and prepared to take on these rivals of Samus's, in whatever case that may be. Prime 3 says you gotta get geared up and you gotta do it fast. Which does take away from the exploration. But there's this level of urgency that is implied in the game itself, where the commander, what's his name? General Dane, or Commander Dane. The whole mentality he had is, hey, I have this task that needs to be completed. And to do it, I need to do this. I need you to do this. We are gathering the fleet for a end to finish this battle. And as soon as you join up, we are heading through the wormhole so that we can duel against Dark Samus. That is what he specifies. That is what he says. And so, you already know what the end game, the final goal, is supposed to be. Samus needs to explore to get the keys through, or get the last key to use the warp gate from the Valhalla. you need to get the power cells to access the Valhalla. This is all you get for context at this point in time. And I think, despite it being a little bit lackluster, a little bit fast-paced for my liking, it does its job beautifully. There's urgency. There is a level of, I have to get this done. Not just for my sake, but for the sake of the galaxy as a whole. See, something that doesn't really get interpreted the easiest with Primes 1 and 2 is that what happens on Talon 4 or Aether stays on Talon 4 or Aether. The idea being that, yeah, the planet's gonna die, but what else? With the Ing, it added a little bit more pressure because if Samus failed, they would eventually reach other planets. That was the implication that you were given in Prime 2. But Prime 3, you've already seen what they're capable of. The threat of Dark Samus, of Phase and Phazon, the Space Pirates, is far greater than anything a single lone hunter can do. And so, despite the fact that Samus is by far and away the most powerful and potent hunter in the galaxy at this time, there is much more that still needs to be handled, dealt with, and with a swift and deft hand. This is what I need to get across. There is so much more than what meets the eye in this circumstance. If Samus fails to eradicate Dark Samus, Phase, and the Phazon-afflicted space pirates all in one go, then all the problems that she has been fighting against for now, well, in my case, it's been just over a year, will have been for naught. Everything that she has done has weight and meaning, but everything that she has done could also come back to haunt her if things are not handled carefully and properly from the word go. Prime 3 tries to showcase this. If the space pirates maintain access to Phazon, what's to say they aren't going to continue trying to spread it to other planets? Sure, it might not be as potent as a Phazon seed, but who said anything about needing a Phazon seed to continue doing it? They have other means. Technically, they have means of moving Phazon from one area to another, and it's a self-replicating, effectively biohazard. This is an incredibly dangerous item for anyone. If we leave Phase aside, then it's just going to make more Phazon seeds, and it might not all end up in the same area like this batch did. Which means, if it makes another batch of seeds, we might end up where Elysia will have to hunt down another entire batch from one end of the world to the other to make sure that Samus gets it all, that Samus handles the problem in its entirety. And if Dark Samus is left alone, if Phase is left, if Dark Samus is left, or if good old-fashioned space pirates are left, any one of those three hazards can come back to bite us. Samus, or rather Dark Samus, is the worst of them. Dark Samus, for all intents and purposes, is the anti-hunter. It's the one that Samus has the most investment in defeating. Because if Samus defeats Dark Samus, the likelihood of long-term peace is significantly higher than if left alone. Dark Samus has shown that it is manipulative, cunning, powerful, plans ahead, and is in many ways, shapes, and forms more dangerous than almost any hunter in the galaxy. In fact, I would argue by what you're about to see in my final battle coming up in about 2-ish weeks, you'll find that Dark Samus had more than enough going for it to beat even Samus quite handedly. You would find that Dark Samus has more than enough capability to make the entire Federation bend at the knee. You would find that Dark Samus is more than powerful enough to handle anything that Samus, the Federation, Aether, even the Chozo could throw at. There is, in the primary timeline, nothing except, well, there is only one creature in the entire timeline of the original series that is possible to beat Dark Samus. And that is the X-Parasite. Even then, that is not a good thing. What you would end up with, ironically, is that let's just take a little bit of a moment here and do a little bit of a thought experiment. Samus and Dark Samus. We already know that the X-Parasite is incredibly powerful. Powerful enough that it was able to take over Samus's suit and replicate it about 10 times over in the span of about 8 hours, over the span of Metroid Fusion. This is an incredibly dangerous thing. Take that same problem and have it replicate Phazon infused Samus with that is bloodthirsty and hungry for more power. What you end up with is an incredibly dangerous situation should Dark Samus survive the final encounter. Now, I'm pretty sure it has been confirmed, at least I'm going to leave that in quotations here, confirmed by Retro that once the end of the series of Prime 3 is hit, that's it. There is no more Phazon, no more Dark Samus. But let's say that a decade, 2 decades later, or almost, they've changed their minds. What if there is more to it? Would Dark Samus come back and visit Vuros? Or maybe there's more to this Phazon threat than meets the eye. There's all sorts of options that come up when we start talking about hypothetical and theoretical endgame solutions when we get talking about Metroid as a whole. Because despite the fact that the Metroid franchise is incredibly well put together, that leaves only the threads behind that it wants to leave behind, there's still much that we don't know. There are still things that we could, as gamers, speculate and theorize on for decades. And well, sure, most theories kind of come to a head with the next game, and it's, oh yeah, of course this was a problem here because it's being solved over here. Of course the Metroids are not allowed to live, or are not allowed to exist because they are easy bioweapons. So we'll have Samus eradicate them. What happens to all of SR388? Who knows? Metroid Fusion comes up. Oh, would you look at that? Defeating all the Metroids left an opening for another more dangerous creature. Who would have thought it? These things come up on a regular basis. So, if we were to use that kind of mentality, that there's always a bigger, badder thing out there, then what would be the bigger bad in Prime 4? Because that's the reality, is we're getting to a point where the biggest bad has to somehow be worse than the planet Phase and Dark Samus. Now we have seen a little bit of tidbits in what could possibly be more dangerous than the pair of them. And that includes the Machtroids, as well as other beings such as other hunters. See, ironically, with Silex being reintroduced as a major enemy, Samus has to deal with another hunter problem. Something that she hasn't dealt with properly since Metroid Hunters and Prime 3. Now, don't get me wrong. I was under the impression before Prime 3 that all of the hunters in Metroid Prime Hunters were defeated and eradicated. That there was no going back. And maybe that's still a thing. Maybe that's true. But I want to ask an additional question. How many hunters are there? We know of, by the end of Prime 3, 10 total hunters. 11 if you want to count Dark Samus. 12 if you also want to count the SAX as a bounty hunter. Theoretically, I wouldn't argue too hard against that. We know of 10 hunters. 6 of them have ambiguous end results in the form of they fought against the final boss of Metroid Prime Hunters in the form of Goria, and Goria did its due diligence to try to defeat Samus and fails. This is all well and good. Now, what I didn't realize when I played it is that I got the bad ending, because I didn't realize there was a good ending. But all of this is kind of it's kind of 50-50. I found that Goria was hard enough to defeat before trying to get the good ending that I don't really necessarily feel the need to go after it anymore. But the 6 hunters, we know of one that's making a return. The hunters in Prime 3 were admittedly substantially weaker than I would have liked them to be, but far more potent than anything that came up in Prime Hunters. And I want to make that abundantly clear before I say what I'm going to say next. And what I'm going to say next is that the hunters in Prime Hunters were so lackluster by comparison that I actually opted to go after the somewhat stronger, or after the quote-unquote stronger hunters instead of fighting off those robots, because I had more of an issue fighting the robots in pairs of 2 than I did fighting the hunters individually. Maybe that's just a me problem, but the reason I want to kind of point that out is that we might have only scratched the surface. See, if we are to assume that the hunters in Metroid Prime Hunters, which is arguably the least necessary game in the trilogy, or in the Prime side of the franchise, suddenly had multiple enemies that have learned from prior encounters with Samus, you would end up with an incredibly dangerous, well thought out group. I'm not saying that they're all going to gang up on Samus and Euros or anything like that, but that they may or may not have some issues. How do I want to word this? They may or may not have unfinished business with Samus, which may come back to haunt us in a later game. As a result of this, I want to kind of say very outright that I would love to see what the end goal of the franchise would be. I want to say that Prime 4 starts up another trilogy, another whole section in the franchise, where we get yet another full storyline with a new antagonist, new everything, and that builds upon the prior, builds upon what came before. And that's a very tall order for a game, or a single game, let alone a franchise as storied as Metroid. But be that as it may, I I want to kind of talk or touch base with the end of Prime 3. Because I kind of want to make one or two things kind of open-minded here. The first is that once Bryyo is completed, I think I have like 2 items that are on the pirate homeworld left before we hit the Valhalla. The GFS Valhalla, I'm planning on having be a one-off run. In and out, 1 episode, done, and off we go to the finale. And heading to the finale, the end game, the final interaction of Metroid Prime 3. There's a couple things that I kind of want to touch base on. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge that the Hypermode challenge, while I initially thought that it would be less interesting or less amusing to me just playing the game in general than a totally new franchise or something more robust than just playing the game at a hard difficulty, I didn't foresee the level of difficulty that Prime 1, 2, and 3 had to offer. And I want to make that kind of open-minded statement before I go too much further. Prime 1, as I'm unsure many of you have heard, I actually lost about 6 times throughout the game. I fell to a couple oddball circumstances, a lava pool here, a little bit of phazon radiation there. I fell at the beginning of near the end of, what was it? I fell at the bottom of the phazon mines against that mini-boss that guards the power bombs. I fell numerous times in Prime 1. And this is important to note. Because if I fell at any point in Prime 1, then there was going to be times later on in Prime 2 and 3 that would come back to haunt me. I lost to Ridley at least 2 to 3 times. I lost numerous times throughout this challenge, and I want to make this very abundantly clear that despite what it's seeming like a very open-minded, open-ended challenge, there was much more at stake for me. When it came to Prime 2, I failed against a couple bosses. I think I lost more times to the Boost Guardian and more times to the Emperor Ing each than I lost in all of Prime 1. And that to me is a pretty impressive statement to make. I lost so many times in this hard mode challenge that it never really needed anything extra. And that's something that I find really hard to admit, is a game that took itself seriously enough that I didn't need to apply any additional unnecessary challenge means that this game, this franchise, took its difficulty very seriously. Now, I'm not saying every game has to be notoriously hard. I'm not saying every game needs to beat me up 5 ways to Sunday. But I am going to say that Prime 3 on numerous occasions caught me off guard. I lost, I believe, to Moganar. I lost, if my memory serves, to Helios twice. I lost to multiple bosses throughout the game, including Rundus. And I think I even lost... No, I didn't lose to Gore. But I lost to Rundus. I lost to Omega Ridley 7 times. And going into the final battle in the near future here, I have to acknowledge that I very well may lose. And knowing what happened in Prime 2 when I lost to Emperor Ing and Dark Samus, I'm worried that the finale may just break me. That there may be more losses, more weaknesses, more failures ahead. So, in honor of that, there will actually be one additional bonus video where I will show a couple of my notable failures throughout the final couple runs, assuming I have them, just as a bonus, hey, this is what actually happened. Note that these will be videos that are unlisted as part of a backup, as if you want more information, if you want to see how things went to get me to where I got, that might be something to look into. But until next time, I hope you have a fantastic day, and